You know what's fascinating? Every time you turn on the news, some economist is confidently explaining why inflation happened, why unemployment rose, why the recession came, always after the fact. They're brilliant at telling stories about the past. But here's the thing that drove Milton Friedman absolutely crazy. They could never predict what would happen next. And you've noticed this, haven't you? In 2021, we were told inflation was transitory. Then it was Putin's fault. Then it was corporate greed. Then it was supply chains. The story keeps changing, but the experts never lose their authority. They're never held accountable for being spectacularly wrong. Friedman saw something in the 1950s that almost nobody else could see. Something so revolutionary, it would transform economics from a debating society into an actual science. And here's what's amazing. He wasn't smarter than other economists. He wasn't working with better data. He just asked one devastatingly simple question that changed everything. That question was, can you prove it? Now does this sound reasonable? Not do important people believe it? Not even is the logic internally consistent? Simply, can you make a prediction that could be proven wrong? Because here's what Friedman understood that his colleagues didn't. If your economic theory can explain everything, if it can rationalize any outcome after the fact, then it actually explains nothing. It's not science. It's storytelling dressed up in mathematical clothing. Think about weather forecasters for a moment. When they predict rain and the sun shines, we know they were wrong. There's accountability. The prediction was falsifiable. It could be tested against reality and proven incorrect. But economists? They predicted 25 of the last 3 recessions, as the joke goes, and somehow they're all still employed, still respected, still quoted on television. Friedman looked at this absurdity and decided to do something radical. He would make economics work like physics. He would generate predictions that could actually be wrong, predictions specific enough, precise enough, that reality could prove them false. And then something extraordinary happened. His predictions kept coming true, decades before events occurred, with uncanny accuracy, while everyone else was surprised. That wasn't magic, that was method. And in the next few minutes, you're going to learn exactly how he did it, step by step from scratch, in a way that will transform how you evaluate every economic claim you ever hear again. You're not crazy for being confused about economics. The confusion is the point. When experts speak in incomprehensible jargon, when they contradict themselves without consequence, when their predictions fail but their authority remains intact, that's not your failure to understand. That's their failure to be scientific. Friedman understood your frustration 70 years ago. He saw a professional economist spouting sophisticated nonsense, and he rebelled. What you're about to discover is the exact intellectual toolkit he developed, not to win academic debates, but to understand reality, to make predictions that actually work, to separate signal from noise. By the end of this episode, you will possess a framework that most professional economists never learned. You'll know how to test economic claims against evidence. You'll recognize nonsense instantly, and you'll understand why Friedman could see what was coming while everyone else was blindsided. If you want to discover more about thinkers like Friedman who cut through conventional wisdom with intellectual rigor, subscribe to this channel where we explore minds that transform how we understand freedom, markets, and human nature. Let me take you back to the 1940s and 50s, because you need to understand just how different economics was back then. Picture academia completely dominated by Keynesian thinking. The idea that government spending and central planning could fine-tune the economy like a machine. Smart people, sophisticated mathematics, elegant theories. But here's what nobody was doing: making testable predictions. Friedman noticed something strange. His colleagues would build beautiful theoretical models, write equations across entire blackboards, publish in prestigious journals. But when their predictions failed, nothing happened. They just adjust the theory, add new variables, explain why this time was different. The theory was unfalsifiable. It was intellectual jello. Push on it anywhere and it just molds around your hand. You know what this reminds me of? Think about horoscopes. You will face challenges this month, but also opportunities. Can that prediction ever be wrong? Of course not. Everything that happens fits. That's not insight. That's vacuous generalization designed to seem profound. Friedman had spent time studying physics and natural sciences, and he saw the crucial difference. In physics, when you predict that an object will fall at 9.8 meters per second squared, and it doesn't, your theory is wrong. Period. You don't get to explain it away. Reality is the ultimate judge. So he asked, why can't economics work the same way? Now, his colleagues thought this was naive. They'd say, Milton, economics isn't like physics. Human beings aren't billiard balls. Society is complex. History doesn't repeat precisely. We can't run controlled experiments on entire economies. And here's where Friedman's genius emerged. He said, you're right, we can't run controlled experiments, but we can make conditional predictions. We can say if X happens, Y will follow. And then reality will tell us if we're right or wrong. Notice how radical this was. Most economists were trying to describe how the economy should work according to their theoretical preferences. Friedman said, forget that. Tell me what will happen. Make a prediction. Stick your neck out. In 1963, he co-authored A Monetary History of the United States with Anna Schwartz. This book did something revolutionary. It went back through American economic history and tested whether monetary policy, how much money the Federal Reserve created or destroyed, could predict economic outcomes. And the pattern was stunning. Every major depression, every significant boom, every inflation, every deflation, they all correlated with specific monetary events. Not perfectly, because economics isn't physics, but powerfully enough that you could make predictions. Here's what fascinates me most. Friedman wasn't looking for correlations that confirmed his biases. He was looking for patterns that could be proven wrong. He'd say, if the money supply grows by X%, inflation should follow by roughly Y% after Z months. Those numbers could be tested. Reality could falsify them. And when you make falsifiable predictions, something beautiful happens. You learn. When you're wrong, you know it. You adjust. You improve. This is how science progresses. Not through clever arguments, but through confrontation with reality. Imagine applying this to the economic claims you hear every day. Politician says, this spending program will create jobs. Okay, how many jobs? By when? Measured how? If those jobs don't materialize, will you admit the program failed? Or the Federal Reserve says, we're confident inflation will remain low despite printing trillions. Based on what evidence? What specific prediction follows from that confidence? What would prove you wrong? See how the method changes everything? Friedman wasn't being difficult. He was being scientific. Wait till you see how this simple insistence on testability demolished entire schools of economic thought that had dominated for decades. Here's where it gets practical. Friedman didn't just say make predictions. He had a specific structure for how to do it scientifically. And once you see the structure, you'll never look at economic claims the same way again. First component, specify the initial conditions clearly. Friedman would say, given these specific circumstances, this level of money supply, this tax structure, this regulatory environment, what should we expect? Notice the precision. Not when government spends a lot, but when government spending increases from X% to Y% of GDP, while the Federal Reserve expands the monetary base by Z%. Why does this matter? Because vague predictions can never be wrong. Government intervention causes problems is an unfalsifiable ideology. When government imposed price controls on gasoline in 1973, we should expect shortages to appear within 3 to 6 months is a testable scientific hypothesis. You know what this reminds me of? Think about your doctor. If they say you should feel better eventually, that's useless. But if they say, take this antibiotic twice daily for 10 days and the infection should clear within 2 weeks, you can actually know if the treatment worked. Same principle. Second component, derive a specific measurable prediction. Friedman was famous for his quantity theory of money, which essentially predicted. If you increase the money supply faster than economic growth, you get inflation. Not maybe, not sometimes. Predictably, with a lag of roughly 18 to 24 months. That's specific enough to be wrong. If the money supply triples and prices don't rise, the theory is falsified. Friedman stuck his neck out. He gave reality the power to prove him wrong. Compare that to modern economic pronouncements. Inflation is transitory. What does that even mean? Transitory for how long? 6 months? 6 years? What level of inflation counts as non-transitory? The claim is designed to be unfalsifiable, which means it's unscientific. Third component, establish the time frame and mechanism. This is crucial. Friedman didn't just predict that money printing causes inflation. He explained how it works and when you'd see results. The mechanism, people have more dollars chasing the same amount of goods, so prices bid up. The time frame, roughly 18 to 24 months because monetary effects work through the economy gradually. Why specify mechanism and timing? Because that's how you distinguish causation from correlation. Lots of things correlate with inflation. Sunspot activity probably correlates with something economic, but only actual causal mechanisms let you predict and intervene. Here's a real example of Friedman deploying this method. In the early 1970s, Nixon imposed wage and price controls to fight inflation. Mainstream economists supported this. They said it would work because, well, if you legally forbid prices from rising, inflation stops. Simple. Friedman made a different prediction. He said, price controls don't address the underlying cause. Too much money chasing too few goods. So what will happen? First, artificial shortages, as sellers can't raise prices to meet demand. Second, black markets emerging. Third, when controls are eventually removed, massive inflation, as suppressed price increases all hit at once. That's a scientific prediction. Specific mechanisms, clear timeline, falsifiable. And what happened? Exactly what Friedman predicted. Gas lines appeared because price controls meant shortages. Quality deteriorated as producers cut costs since they couldn't raise prices. When controls were lifted in 1974, inflation exploded to double digits. Friedman was proven right not because he was lucky, but because his method worked. He identified the actual causal mechanism, monetary expansion, and predicted its effects. Notice something powerful here. Friedman's predictions often contradicted common sense and expert consensus. Price controls sound like they should control prices. Government spending sounds like it should help the economy. But scientific method doesn't care about intuition. It cares about testable predictions confronting reality. If you want to avoid being manipulated by economic claims, hit like on this video so more people learn to demand the same scientific rigor from experts that we demand from weather forecasters. Actual predictions that can actually be wrong. The method gets even more powerful when you understand what Friedman called positive economics versus normative economics. That distinction changes everything, and it's coming next. This might be the most important section you read all year, because Friedman discovered that most economic confusion comes from mixing two completely different types of questions. Positive economics asks, what will happen? What are the consequences of this policy? These are scientific questions with objectively testable answers. Normative economics asks, what should be? What do we value? What's fair or just? These are ethical questions involving subjective values. The confusion happens when economists smuggle their normative preferences into positive claims, disguising value judgments as scientific conclusions. Let me show you how this works in practice, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Economist says, we should raise a minimum wage to help poor workers. Sounds like a testable economic claim, right? But it's actually mixing positive and normative. Friedman would dissect it like this. Positive question. If we raise the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15, what happens to employment levels, especially for young and low-skilled workers? This is scientifically testable. You can look at historical evidence, compare different regions, make predictions. And the evidence is pretty clear. Significant minimum wage increases reduce employment opportunities for the least skilled workers. That's a positive claim based on empirical research. Normative question. Is it worth accepting higher unemployment among some workers to raise wages for others? This is a value judgment. Science can't answer it. Friedman might value maximum employment opportunity. Someone else might value higher wages for those who keep jobs. Neither is scientifically correct. They reflect different priorities. Here's why this distinction is so powerful. When someone says we should raise minimum wage to help poor workers, they're hiding a normative judgment. We should prioritize wage levels over employment levels. Inside what sounds like a positive claim, this will help poor workers. But the positive evidence suggests minimum wage increases harm many of the workers supposedly being helped by pricing them out of jobs entirely. The normative debate, whether that trade-off is worth it, is legitimate. But first you need the positive facts straight. You know what this is like? Imagine your friend says you should buy this car because it's reliable, sounds factual, but they're mixing this car as a good reliability rating. Testable positive claim. With reliability is what you should prioritize over cost, speed, or appearance, normative value judgment. Maybe you actually care more about style than reliability. That's your values, not science. Friedman used this distinction devastatingly in debates. Someone would say we need government health care to ensure everyone gets medical care. He'd respond, that's mixing positive and normative. The positive question is, will government health care actually deliver more medical care than a private system? That's testable. Let's look at the evidence. The normative question is, even if government health care delivers less total care but distributes it differently, is that worth it? That's your values, not economics. See how he separated the factual claim from the value judgment? Most people had never experienced that clarity before. Here's a contemporary example that'll drive this home. Modern monetary theory economists claim government can print money without causing inflation as long as there's economic slack. That sounds like a testable positive claim. Friedman would say, fine, make a specific prediction. How much can government print? Over what time frame? What counts as economic slack? What inflation rate would prove you wrong? Suddenly it gets slippery. They'll say, well, it depends on many factors. Translation, the claim isn't actually testable. It's normative preference. We want government to spend a lot, disguised as positive economics. This distinction matters enormously in your daily life. When someone makes an economic claim, ask yourself, is this a testable prediction about what will happen, positive, or a value judgment about what should happen, normative? If it's positive, demand specifics. What exactly will occur? When? Measured how? What would prove it wrong? If it's normative, recognize it's about values. That's legitimate. We all have values. But don't let anyone tell you their values are scientific or that disagreeing with them means you deny economics. Friedman's scientific method exposed how much economic debate was really just disagreement about values pretending to be disagreement about facts. Once you separate them, clarity emerges. And that clarity becomes even sharper when you understand how Friedman tested his theories against historical evidence, which is where we're going next. Since economists can't run controlled experiments, we can't rear-end the Great Depression with different policies to see what works. Friedman had to get creative about testing theories. His solution, use economic history as a natural laboratory. Here's how this works. Friedman would look for situations where economic conditions were similar except for one key variable. That difference becomes your experiment. If theory predicts that changing X should produce result Y, and you find historical cases where X changed and Y followed, you've got evidence. The monetary history of the United States that I mentioned earlier is the masterwork of this method. Friedman and Schwartz analyzed nearly a century of American economic history, meticulously documenting the relationship between monetary policy and economic outcomes. They discovered something extraordinary. Every major economic contraction was preceded by a significant reduction in the money supply. Every single one. Not most, not usually. Every time. The Great Depression? The Federal Reserve contracted the money supply by a third between 1929 and 1933. Predictable result: catastrophic deflation and unemployment. But most economists at the time blamed everything except monetary policy, stock market speculation, overproduction, underconsumption, capitalism itself. Friedman showed them the data. When money supply contracts dramatically, economic disaster follows. That's not ideology. That's observed pattern across decades and different circumstances. But here's where his scientific integrity becomes really impressive. Friedman didn't just cherry-pick confirming evidence. He looked for disconfirming cases too. Were there times when the money supply contracted but nothing bad happened? Or when it expanded but inflation didn't follow? And he found exceptions, which he then explained. Sometimes the velocity of money, how fast money circulates, changed, offsetting monetary effects. Sometimes the lag was longer or shorter than typical. The theory became more nuanced and accurate by confronting anomalies. This is what actual science looks like. You don't ignore evidence that challenges your theory. You refine the theory to account for it. Think about how different this is from typical economic argument. Someone says government spending stimulates the economy. Look at World War II. That's cherry-picking one case that fits their narrative. Friedman would say, let's look at all cases of increased government spending across different contexts. What's the consistent pattern? What are the exceptions and why? Here's a powerful example of this method in action. The inflation of the 1970s. In 1968, Friedman predicted that inflation would rise significantly, hitting double digits within a few years. Everyone thought he was crazy. The Federal Reserve was confident. Most economists disagreed. How could America have serious inflation? Friedman's reasoning: I'm looking at the monetary expansion data. The Fed has been increasing the money supply at rates unprecedented in peacetime, based on a historical relationship between money growth and inflation. With a typical 18 to 24-month lag, we should expect inflation to accelerate dramatically by 1970 to 72. That is scientific prediction derived from historical patterns. And what happened? Inflation began rising in 1969, hit 5 to 6% by 1970, and reached double digits by 1974, exactly as the historical evidence suggested it would. Meanwhile, Keynesian economists were baffled. Their models said you couldn't have high inflation and high unemployment simultaneously. They called it the Phillips curve trade-off. But the 1970s produced both, called stagflation. Friedman's framework predicted it perfectly because he was using historical evidence scientifically, not just theoretical models. You know what this reminds me of? Think about sports analytics. Traditional scouts evaluated baseball players by gut feeling and conventional wisdom. Then analysts started using historical data. What statistics actually predict future performance? They discovered that conventional wisdom was often wrong. Players who looked good didn't necessarily produce results. Data beat intuition. Friedman did the same thing with economics. What does historical evidence actually show about monetary policy effects, regardless of what theories or intuitions say? This approach requires intellectual humility. You have to be willing to have your favorite theories contradicted by evidence. Most economists weren't. They'd rather adjust the evidence to fit their theories. Friedman did the opposite, and that's why his predictions kept coming true while theirs kept failing. The final piece of this method, and perhaps the most practically important for you, is understanding how Friedman dealt with complexity and uncertainty. Because the real world is messy, and that's where most economic analysis falls apart. Here's where most economists fail spectacularly. They either oversimplify to the point of uselessness, or they make things so complicated that nothing can ever be proven wrong. Friedman found a middle path that's absolutely brilliant. His principle was this: a good theory simplifies reality by identifying the crucial variables while ignoring the irrelevant noise. The question isn't whether a theory is realistic in capturing every detail. No useful theory does that. The question is, does it make accurate predictions? Friedman had this famous example about billiard players. A physicist could predict where balls will go using complex calculations about angles, force, friction, spin. But an expert pool player doesn't know physics. They play by intuition and experience. Now, which explanation is better? The physicist is more realistic about the actual thought process. But for predicting shots, assuming the player calculates perfectly, even though they don't consciously, works better than trying to model their actual mental state. Same with economics. Friedman would say, assume people behave rationally in pursuing their interests. Is that perfectly realistic? No. People make mistakes, act emotionally, behave inconsistently. But for predicting aggregate behavior, the rational actor assumption works better than trying to model every psychological quirk. This drove his critics crazy. They'd say, but Milton, people aren't perfectly rational. He'd respond, I don't care the assumption is realistic. Does it generate accurate predictions? Yes, then it's a good assumption. This is so important for evaluating economic claims today. Someone will say, your theory assumes rational behavior, but behavioral economics shows people are irrational. Therefore, your theory is wrong. Friedman's response, you're confusing realism of assumptions with accuracy of predictions. Show me that accounting for irrationality produces better predictions. If it doesn't, your more realistic theory is actually worse science. Let me show you how this works practically. Take the minimum wage example again. You could build a massively complex model accounting for every factor. Regional cost differences, industry variations, worker skill distributions, employer market power, employee bargaining position, consumer demand elasticity in different sectors, substitution effects between labor and capital. Or you could use Friedman's approach. Assume employers hire workers when the value they produce exceeds their cost. If you legally require employers to pay more than a worker's productivity justifies, employment of those workers falls. Simple. Which model makes better predictions? The simple one. Consistently, across different contexts, significant minimum wage increases reduce employment among low-skilled workers. The complex model might be more realistic, but it's worse science because it's less predictive. Now, Friedman wasn't naive. He knew some complexity matters. The question is, which complexity? His method. Include only the factors that significantly affect predictions. For monetary policy, the crucial variable is the relationship between money supply growth and economic growth. Include that, and you can predict inflation pretty well. You can add 100 other variables, fiscal policy details, international trade flows, consumer confidence indices, political stability measures, and you won't improve predictions much. This principle of parsimony, don't make things more complex than necessary, is what separates science from academic gamesmanship. Because here's the dirty secret of economics academia. Complexity provides cover. If your model has 50 variables with complex interactions, when it fails, you can always blame some variable you didn't include or some interaction you got wrong. The model can never really be proven false. Friedman's simple models had no such protection. When he predicted inflation based on money supply growth, either inflation came or it didn't. No hiding. You know what this is like in your own life? Think about dieting. Some guru sells you a plan with 17 rules about food combining, timing, supplements, specific exercises on specific days, foods that boost metabolism, others that trigger fat storage mode. Or someone says, eat fewer calories than you burn and you'll lose weight, which is more realistic. The complex plan sounds sophisticated, but which actually predicts results. The simple principle, consistently, reliably, that's better science, even if it's less impressive sounding. When you hear economic analysis, ask, is this complexity adding predictive power or just making the theory unfalsifiable? Friedman taught us to prefer bold simplicity over protective complexity. And now you understand a complete scientific method. From identifying positive questions, to deriving testable predictions, to using historical evidence, to maintaining simplicity. Time to see what this means for you personally. You started this episode probably thinking economics was just sophisticated opinion. Smart people arguing about their preferences using fancy words. And in most hands, that's exactly what it is. But Friedman showed you something radically different. Economics can be scientific, not in the sense of perfect precision. Human society will never be as predictable as chemical reactions, but in the sense that matters most. Testable predictions that could be proven wrong and often prove right. Think about what you've discovered here. The structure of scientific prediction. Specify initial conditions, derive measurable outcomes, establish mechanisms and timeframes. The crucial distinction between positive and normative questions, between what is and what should be, the use of historical evidence as laboratory when experiments are impossible, the principle of parsimonious simplification, include what matters for prediction, exclude protective complexity. This isn't just academic methodology. This is intellectual self-defense. Because every single day, you're bombarded with economic claims designed to manipulate you. This policy will create jobs. That program will reduce inequality. This spending is an investment. That regulation protects consumers. Before Friedman, you could only evaluate these claims ideologically. Do they align with my political preferences? Now you can evaluate them scientifically. When someone makes an economic claim, you can ask, what specific, measurable prediction follows from this? What initial conditions are specified? What time frame? What would prove this wrong? Is this a positive claim about what will happen or a normative claim about what should happen? Most claims collapse under these questions because they were never scientific. They were always just preferences disguised as expertise. But some claims survive. Some people make genuine predictions based on sound theory and historical evidence. Friedman taught you how to recognize the difference. And here's what's profound. Once you demand scientific standards from economic claims, entire political narratives disintegrate. So much of what passes for expert consensus is actually just shared ideology that can't survive contact with evidence. Friedman didn't just give you a method for understanding economics. He gave you a method for intellectual liberation, freedom from authority that can't justify its claims, from expertise that can't predict, from consensus that can't be tested. That's not just more accurate thinking. That's power. The power to see clearly while others are confused, to predict while others are surprised, to understand what's really happening while official narratives crumble. You're not at their mercy anymore. Starting today, when you hear an economic claim from politicians, media, academic economists, anyone, run it through Friedman's scientific filter. First question, is this positive or normative? Am I being told what will happen or what should happen? If someone says we need to tax the rich more, ask them, is this a factual claim that it will produce specific results or a value claim about fairness? Separate them. Second question, if it's a positive claim, what's the testable prediction? Raising taxes on the wealthy will increase revenue. Okay, by how much? Over what period? What tax rate? What would prove this wrong? Third question, what's the historical evidence? Has this been tried before under similar conditions? What happened? Don't let anyone tell you this time is different without explaining specifically what's different and why it matters. Fourth question, is a theory simple enough to actually be falsifiable? If the explanation requires 17 variables and complex interactions, be suspicious. Good science is bold and simple. You'll find that most economic claims fail these tests immediately. They're mixing positive and normative. They're making vague predictions that can never be wrong. They're ignoring contrary historical evidence. They're hiding behind complexity. When you find claims that pass these tests, specific, testable, evidence-based, simple, take them seriously even if they challenge your preferences. That's how you learn truth rather than confirming biases. In 6 months of applying this method, you'll understand economic reality better than most people with economics degrees, because you'll have learned what most academic programs never teach: how to distinguish science from sophisticated storytelling. And when the next crisis comes, and it will, you won't be blindsided like the experts always are. You'll have seen it coming because you learn to think scientifically. Milton Friedman once said something that perfectly captures what you just learned. The true test of scientific theory is not whether it's plausible or aesthetically pleasing or ideologically acceptable. The only test is whether its predictions are borne out by experience. Do you feel the power of that standard? Do you recognize how it cuts through decades of accumulated nonsense? Imagine your life 6 months from now, after applying this method consistently. You won't be perfect. Friedman never promised perfection, only honest science. But you'll be dramatically clearer than almost everyone around you. When the Federal Reserve announces policy and the financial media analyzes it, you'll immediately identify what's the testable prediction here. When politicians debate economic programs, you'll separate positive claims from normative values. When experts are confused by unexpected inflation or unemployment, you'll check the monetary data and see it was entirely predictable. You'll see what's coming while others are perpetually surprised. Not because you're smarter, but because you demand scientific standards while they accept authoritative pronouncements. That clarity is freedom. Freedom from manipulation. Freedom from confusion. Freedom to make informed decisions protecting your family, your wealth, your future. This channel exists to discover together the wisdom of thinkers like Milton Friedman. People who refuse to accept conventional wisdom when evidence contradicted it, who built rigorous frameworks for understanding reality rather than rationalizing preferences. Subscribe if you want to continue this journey of intellectual liberation. In the next video, we'll explore Friedman's devastating critique of the Phillips curve, how he destroyed the fundamental assumption of Keynesian economics using the exact scientific method you just learned. See you there. And meanwhile, may evidence be your guide and reality your teacher.